The werewolf princess chose me as her champion. Now the king wants me dead. The average grip strength of a Lunaris werewolf is enough to crush hardened steel, which makes the act of holding a human hand a delicate exercise in lethal restraint. Jard knew that if Princess Marlena lost control of her emotions during their first private meeting, he would not survive the encounter, yet he did not flinch when she reached out to touch his face. This is not a situation where a man is fearless because he is stupid or unaware of the danger, but rather it is about a man who understands that trust is a far more dangerous weapon than a sword. The king wanted him dead before the sun rose, but Jard had already done the one thing the king could never do, which was to tame the storm inside the princess, without raising a voice or a fist. To understand how a stable boy ended up in the private chambers of the most dangerous predator on the planet, we have to walk through the heavy iron gates of the Citadel of Moons, where the air is always thick with the scent of pine and roasted meat, and the metallic tang of sharpened weapons. The planet Lunaris does not forgive weakness, and gravity here feels a little heavier than what you might be used to on Earth, so it pulls at your bones and demands that you stand taller just to keep your footing. In the lower courtyards, the Festival of the Silver Moon was in full swing, and the noise was a physical wall of sound composed of heavy drums and deep growls and the clatter of ceremonial armor. It was the most important night of the decade because the right of choosing was finally upon the kingdom, and every eligible noble male from the 12 great clans had gathered to present themselves to the royal family. Jard was entirely invisible to the nobility passing by on the overhead walkways, because to them, he was just another soft-skinned human servant tasked with the dirty work of the stables. He moved with an economy of motion that comes from years of surviving in a place where everything is stronger than you, and he wore a battered leather vest that had seen better seasons along with simple boots that were caked in the dust of the arena floor. He was not looking at the grand balcony where the royals sat because he was too busy trying to calm a massive hex stalker that was agitated by the noise of the drums. The beast was a 6-legged reptilian mount used by the heavy cavalry, and it was snapping its jaws at the torchlight while Jard kept a firm hand on its bridle. He spoke to it in a low and rhythmic register that vibrated in his chest, rather than projecting outward, because he knew that shouting at a predator only invites a challenge. High above in the royal box, the atmosphere was suffocating for different reasons. Princess Marlena sat on a throne of carved obsidian and tried to keep the boredom from showing on her face. She was a striking vision of lethal elegance, with silver-white fur that shimmered under the moonlight and glowing blue eyes that scanned the crowd with a mixture of intelligence and predatory assessment. Her tail was braided with sapphires and silver wire, which was a sign of her station, but it twitched with irritation every time another suitor stepped forward to roar his lineage and present the severed head of some beast he had killed in the borderlands. They were all the same to her because they were all posture and violence and no substance. They looked at her and saw a prize for their clan or a womb for their heirs, but none of them looked at her and saw a person who carried the weight of a kingdom on her shoulders. The king sat beside her, and he was a mountain of gray fur and muscle named Vulcan, who watched the proceedings with a critical eye. He wanted a strong alliance with the northern clans, and he was already favoring a brute named Lord Kale, who was currently strutting in the arena below. Kale was massive even for a werewolf, and he carried a double-bladed axe that weighed as much as a man, yet he swung it around like a toy, while the crowd cheered his display of raw power. Marlena felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach, because she knew that Kale was cruel, and his cruelty would not end at the battlefield, but would follow him into their marriage bed. She gripped the arms of her throne until the stone cracked slightly under her claws, and she wished for anything to break the monotony of this barbaric ritual. That was when the accident happened. The hex stalker that Jard was holding finally snapped. A drunken noble had thrown a heavy goblet over the railing, and it struck the beast directly on its sensitive snout, causing it to rear back and shatter the heavy chains that tethered it to the wall. The creature was 3 tons of scaled muscle and panic, and it charged directly toward a group of spectators near the serving tables. The crowd screamed and scrambled back in a chaotic wave, while the royal guards on the perimeter hesitated because they were afraid to fire their energy lances into the throng of people. Lord Kale, who was closest to the beast, raised his axe and prepared to strike, but his swing was wide and reckless, and would have likely killed the bystanders as well as the animal. Jard did not think about the politics of the situation, or the fact that he was a human interrupting a royal ceremony. He simply saw a terrified animal and a group of people about to die, so he dropped the bucket he was holding and sprinted across the sand. He did not run away from the danger, but ran parallel to the beast to cut off its line of sight. He whistled a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the panic and caused the Hexstalker to skid to a halt and turn its massive head toward him. For a terrifying second, it was just a human man standing in front of a monster with nothing but open hands and calm focus. The beast roared and sprayed saliva across Jard's vest, but he did not flinch or step back. The entire arena went silent as thousands of werewolves watched this small hairless creature stand his ground. Jard began to make a deep rumbling sound in his throat that mimicked the subvocal comfort noise of the Hexstalker's mother. He stepped forward slowly with his hands visible and palms flat, and his eyes locked on the creature's nose rather than its eyes to avoid a challenge. The beast hesitated, and its frantic breathing began to slow as it recognized the sound and the body language of someone who meant it no harm. Lord Kale lowered his axe with a confused sneer, and the guards kept their weapons trained, but nobody moved. Slowly and with infinite patience, Jard reached out and placed his hand on the creature's snout and guided it down until its belly touched the sand in a submissive posture. Marlena watched this from the balcony and felt her heart hammer against her ribs in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She had spent her entire life surrounded by males who solved every problem with violence, and here was a human who had diffused a massacre with nothing but courage and empathy. She saw the way Jard wiped the sweat from his forehead and patted the beast's neck, and she saw the way he ignored the nobles who were staring at him as if he were a ghost. In that moment, she realized that this stable boy possessed a kind of strength that her people had forgotten, and it was the strength of control. The king stood up and prepared to order the guards to remove the human filth from the arena, but Marlena moved faster. She stood up and walked to the edge of the balcony with the ceremonial wreath of moon vines in her hands. The tradition stated that whomever the princess threw the wreath to would be her chosen champion and suitor, and the law was written in the stone of the planet itself, so not even the king could overrule it without risking civil war. Marlena looked down at Lord Kale, who was preening and expecting the wreath, and then she looked past him to the stable boy, who was checking the Hexstalker for injuries. She tossed the wreath. It spun through the air in a perfect arc, and silence reigned so absolute that you could hear the wind whistling through the banners. The wreath landed around Jard's neck with a soft rustle of leaves. He froze and looked down at the silver flowers, and then looked up at the balcony with wide eyes that reflected pure shock. The crowd gasped in a collective intake of breath that sounded like the ocean pulling back before a tsunami. Lord Kale roared in fury and smashed his axe into the sand, while King Vulcan turned to his daughter with eyes burning like coals. Jard barely had time to process what had happened before 4 royal guards in heavy power armor descended upon him. They did not ask him to come along, but simply grabbed him by the arms and hauled him away from the beast. He did not resist because he knew that any struggle would give them an excuse to kill him right there on the sand. As he was dragged toward the dark tunnel of the palace entrance, he looked back one last time and saw Marlena standing tall on the balcony with her chin raised in defiance against her father and the entire court. He realized with a sinking feeling that he had just become the most hated man on Lunaris. The transition from the stables to the royal wing was a blur of stone corridors and rough handling. The guards threw him into a preparation chamber that smelled of lavender and cold water and stripped him of his dirty vest and boots. They scrubbed him down with stiff brushes as if they were trying to wash away his humanity, and then dressed him in a tunic of fine blue silk that felt slippery and wrong against his skin. They gave him a pair of polished black boots and a ceremonial sword that was too light and purely decorative. Jard strapped the sword to his hip and looked in the mirror and saw a stranger staring back. He looked like a sacrifice dressed up for the altar. He was left alone in a waiting room that was larger than the entire barracks he slept in. The walls were adorned with tapestries depicting the great battles of the werewolf clans, and every image was a celebration of blood and conquest. Jard paced the floor and tried to calm his racing heart by focusing on his breathing the same way he did when breaking a wild horse. He knew the political layout of the kingdom well enough to know that the king would try to have him killed quietly to avoid the embarrassment of a human champion. His only chance of survival was the princess, but he did not know if she had chosen him out of genuine interest, or if she was just using him as a tool to spite her father. The heavy oak doors opened and Princess Marlena walked in. The room seemed to shrink around her presence because she was tall and regal and radiated a power that was palpable. She had dismissed her guards at the door, which was a breach of protocol and a sign that she wanted to speak freely. She walked toward him with a fluid grace that was mesmerizing and terrifying, and stopped only a few feet away. Jard could smell the scent of ozone and rain on her fur, and he could see the sharp tips of her claws as she clasped her hands in front of her. She looked him up and down with those glowing blue eyes, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Jard decided that if he was going to die, he would die with his dignity intact, so he straightened his spine and met her gaze directly. He did not bow, and he did not avert his eyes as a servant should. "You realize," Jard said softly, his voice steady despite the dryness in his throat, "that you have effectively signed my death warrant. Your father will not let this stand." Marlena's ears twitched, and a small smile touched her lips that was not entirely devoid of humor. "I know," she replied, her voice a rich contralto that seemed to vibrate in the air. "My father wants a warrior who can crush skulls and lead armies. He wants a monster to breed more monsters. But I saw what you did in the arena, Jard. I saw you stop a 3-ton killing machine without drawing a weapon. Do you know how rare that is among my people?" "It wasn't bravery," Jard said, trying to deflect the praise. "It was just knowing where to touch and what sound to make. Animals are simple. They just want to know they aren't going to be hurt." Marlena took a step closer, and the air between them crackled with tension. "And that is exactly why I chose you. The court is full of men who think power is about how much pain you can inflict. I need a champion who understands that true power is about control. I need someone who can look at a beast and see the fear behind the rage." She paused, and her expression softened into something more vulnerable. "I have a beast inside me too, Jard. And I am tired of everyone being afraid of it or trying to use it. I thought perhaps you might be the only one who wouldn't flinch." Jard looked at her, and for the first time he saw past the princess and the predator. He saw a woman who was trapped in a cage of expectations, just as he was trapped in his social station. He realized that she was terrified of her own future, and she had reached out to him as an anchor in the storm. The realization shifted something in his chest. He was no longer just a victim of circumstance, but a partner in a dangerous game. "I won't flinch," Jard said, and he meant it. "But we need to be realistic. The king is going to come for me. The other suitors are going to come for me. I have a ceremonial sword that couldn't cut cheese, and I am the only human in a castle full of wolves." Marlena reached out then, and that was when she touched his face. Her hand was large, and her claws were sharp enough to open his throat with a twitch, but her touch was incredibly gentle. She traced the line of his jaw with the pad of her thumb, and Jard felt the immense strength she was holding back. It was a promise and a plea all at once. "Then we will have to be smarter than them," she whispered. "You survived the arena because you didn't play by the beast's rules. You changed the game. That is what we must do now. You are my champion, Jard. By the ancient laws, my guards are your guards and my resources are your resources, but you must survive the night. Can you do that?" Jard looked into her glowing eyes and felt a surge of determination that surprised him. He was a stable boy who had spent his life cleaning up after others, but tonight he was standing in the center of the galaxy. "I can survive," he said, "but you have to trust me when I tell you not to fight. Your father expects you to rage. If we want to win this, we have to be the calm in the center of the chaos." The doors burst open before Marlena could respond, and Captain Thorn of the Royal Guard marched in with a squad of soldiers. Thorn was a scarred veteran with black fur and a mechanical eye that whirred as it focused on Jard. He ignored the princess and pointed a gauntleted finger at the human. "The king demands the presence of the champion," Thorn snarled, the word champion dripping with sarcasm. "He wishes to discuss the terms of the engagement. Now." Marlena stepped between Jard and the guards, her posture shifting instantly from intimate to combat-ready. A low growl built in her chest, but Jard placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a shocking breach of etiquette for a human to touch royalty, but it stopped her transformation in its tracks. She looked back at him, and he gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I'm ready," Jard said to the captain, stepping around Marlena. "Lead the way." He walked toward the door with his head held high, knowing that he was walking into a den of wolves who wanted to tear him apart. But as he passed the threshold, he felt the weight of Marlena's gaze on his back, and he knew he wasn't walking alone. He had tamed a hex stalker with a whisper. Now he would have to see if he could tame a king with the truth. The night was young, and the moon was full, and the game had just begun. Walking behind Captain Thorn through the twisting corridors of the Citadel of Moons was less like being escorted, and more like being herded toward a cliff edge. The architecture of the werewolf nobility is designed to make a human feel insignificant, with vaulted ceilings that vanish into shadow and steps that are just slightly too tall for human legs, forcing a stuttering and undignified gait. Jard did not try to match the captain's stride, because that would have been a game he was destined to lose, so instead, he walked at his own measured pace and forced the hulking werewolf to slow down, which established a subtle shift in the power dynamic before they even reached the king's solar. Thorn radiated a silent fury that heated the air around them, and every passing servant flattened themselves against the cold stone walls to avoid his path, but Jard kept his eyes forward and his breathing even. He was mapping the castle in his mind, counting the steps between guard posts, and noting which doors were reinforced, and which were merely decorative, because a stable boy learns early on that knowing the exit is just as important as knowing the work. When the heavy ironwood doors of the solar swung open, they revealed a room that was less a living space and more a command center for a predator. King Vulcan stood by a massive window that overlooked the sprawling bioluminescent forests of Lunaris, and his silhouette was a jagged mountain of fur and muscle against the pale blue glow of the alien flora below. He did not turn around when Jard entered, which was a calculated insult designed to remind the human of his place in the food chain. Thorn shoved Jard forward roughly enough to make him stumble, but Jard turned the stumble into a bow and dropped to one knee, not out of submission, but out of protocol. He waited in the silence that stretched thin and tight like a wire ready to snap, listening to the heavy rhythmic breathing of the king and the distant sounds of the feast continuing below without its guest of honor. Vulcan finally turned, and his face was a mask of weary disgust rather than the explosive rage Jard had expected. The king walked to a heavy table covered in holographic maps and poured himself a goblet of dark wine, ignoring the cup that sat waiting for a guest. He looked at Jard as one might look at a termite that had somehow infested a throne room, a nuisance that was baffling in its audacity. He asked Jard simply why he had not run away when the beast broke loose, and why he thought a human who cleaned dung from boots was fit to stand beside the blood of the ancients. Jard rose slowly and met the king's gaze with a calmness that seemed to irritate the monarch more than insolence would have. He explained that he did not run because running triggers the chase instinct in predators, and he did not claim to be fit for the bloodline, but rather he was fit for the task at hand, which was keeping the princess safe. The king laughed then, a dry barking sound that echoed off the stone walls, and told Jard that he would be dead within the week. Vulcan explained with chilling precision that there were no laws protecting a human in the sparring rings, and that accidents happen every day in a castle built on war. He dismissed Jard with a wave of his clawed hand, telling him to enjoy the soft sheets and the fine food while he could, because the winter of Lunaris was harsh and soft things rarely survived the frost. Jard bowed again and left the room, feeling the target painted on his back burning like a brand. But he also felt a strange sense of clarity, because now he knew the rules of the game were that there were no rules at all. The following weeks fell into a rhythm of dangerous luxury and watchful silence. Jard was given quarters in the guest wing, which was isolated from the main court and constantly guarded by soldiers who spat on the floor when he passed. He knew he could not fight them, and he knew he could not outposture them, so he did what humans have always done when outmatched physically, which is to make themselves indispensable through utility. He began to observe the castle not as a fortress, but as a machine, and he quickly realized that, for all their martial prowess, the werewolves were terrible at logistics. The servants were terrified and disorganized, the supply lines for the kitchens were inefficient, and the waste management systems were constantly backed up, causing a foul stench in the lower levels that the nobles simply ignored or punished the servants for. Jard started quietly interfering. He stopped a group of servants who were trying to haul heavy sacks of grain up the main stairs and showed them how to rig a pulley system using the decorative banner hooks. He reorganized the stable rotations so that the riding beasts were not exhausted and irritable, which reduced the number of accidents and injuries among the handlers. He did not ask for permission, and he did not seek credit, he simply fixed what was broken. The servants, who were mostly lower-caste wolves and conquered species, initially looked at him with suspicion, but that suspicion turned to a silent and fierce loyalty when they realized he was making their lives easier. They began to whisper things to him, secrets about which nobles were gambling away their estates, and which guards were sleeping on duty, and where the blind spots in the security grid were. Jard was building an invisible army, not of warriors, but of eyes and ears. His relationship with Marlena grew in the quiet spaces between the chaos. She would come to his chambers late at night, entering through the balcony doors to avoid the sneers of her own court. They would sit looking out over the glowing fungal forests that stretched to the horizon, where the spores floated in the air like drifting stars. At first she was stiff and regal, treating him like an advisor. She was ashamed to need, but Jard broke down those walls by refusing to treat her like a porcelain doll or a terrifying monster. He asked her about the history of the stars, and she asked him about the resilience of Earth, and they found a common language in the feeling of being an outsider in one's own life. One night the air was particularly heavy with the scent of impending rain, and Marlena was packing the balcony, her claws clicking rhythmically against the stone. She confessed that she could feel the pull of the moons in her blood, a biological imperative to hunt and destroy that terrified her, because she feared one day she would not be able to pull back. She looked at her own hands with a mixture of awe and revulsion, describing the beast as a separate entity that wanted to consume her rational mind. Jard stood up and did something incredibly dangerous, which was to take those lethal hands in his own. He told her that the beast was not a separate entity, but a part of her engine, and that an engine only explodes when you try to block the exhaust. He offered to be her anchor, not by holding her back, but by reminding her of the way home. It was a moment of profound intimacy, where the physical size difference between them, her towering height and muscular density versus his compact human frame, became irrelevant in the face of their emotional alignment. But the castle does not tolerate peace for long. The king's patience had run out, and the training accident he promised was put into motion. It began with a summons to the training grounds, a massive open-air coliseum of hard-packed earth and stone pillars, where the elite guard practiced their lethal arts. Captain Thorn was waiting there, stripped to the waist, revealing a torso scarred by 100 battles and muscles that coiled like steel cables under his black fur. A crowd of nobles had gathered on the overlooking terraces, smirking and whispering, betting on how many seconds the human would last before he was broken beyond repair. Thorn tossed a wooden practice sword at Jard's feet. It was heavy and unbalanced, a useless stick against a werewolf's natural weaponry, but the message was clear. Pick it up and die fighting, or refuse and die a coward. Jard picked up the sword and felt the weight of it testing the balance. He knew he could not block a strike from Thorn because the force alone would shatter his arms regardless of the weapon. He looked up at the terrace and saw Marlena standing there, her knuckles white as she gripped the railing, her eyes wide with panic. She made a move to intervene, but the king placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, holding her in place, forcing her to watch. Thorn grinned, exposing a row of yellowed fangs, and lunged. He moved with a speed that defied physics, covering the 20 feet between them in a blur of motion. Jard did not try to parry. He dropped to the ground, sliding on his knees into the dust, and the captain's fist occupied the space where his head had been a fraction of a second before. The wind of the punch ruffled Jard's hair as he scrambled away, using the momentum to roll behind one of the stone pillars. The crowd laughed, seeing it as a desperate flight, but Jard was calculating. He knew Thorn was angry and arrogant, and that meant he was overcommitting to every strike. The fight became a deadly game of cat and mouse. Thorn smashed the stone pillar, sending chips of rock flying, trying to flush Jard out. Jard used his smaller size to weave through the obstacle course of the training ground, keeping the pillars and weapon racks between him and the monster. He could hear Thorn's breathing becoming ragged, not from exhaustion, but from the fury of being unable to crush this pest. Thorn roared and leaped over a weapon rack, intending to crush Jard from above. Jard saw the shadow moving, and instead of running away, he stepped into the arc of the jump. He used the wooden sword not as a weapon, but as a lever, jamming it between Thorn's ankles as the werewolf landed. Physics is a universal law that even werewolves must obey. Thorn's momentum carried him forward, but his feet were tangled, and he crashed face first into the hard-packed earth with a sickening thud that silenced the crowd. He scrambled to get up, spitting dirt and blood, his dignity shattered. Jard stood 5 feet away, chest heaving, the broken hilt of the wooden sword still in his hand. He did not attack the fallen warrior because that would have been suicide. Instead, he threw the hilt down and looked up at the king. He spread his hands to show he was unarmed and had no intention of continuing. He had proven his point. He wasn't a warrior, but he was a survivor. Thorn scrambled to his feet, eyes burning with a murderous light, prepared to tear Jard apart regardless of the rules, but a sharp command from the balcony stopped him cold. It wasn't the king who spoke, but Marlena. Her voice cut through the air like a whip, ordering Thorn to stand down. The captain hesitated, looking from the king to the princess, and in that moment of hesitation, the tension broke. The king looked down at Jard with a new expression, not respect certainly, but a recalculation. The human was not just a soft thing, he was a slippery thing. Vulcan waved his hand dismissively, signaling the end of the session. Jard limped back to his chambers, his body screaming from the exertion and the few glancing blows he had taken. He collapsed onto the edge of his bed, his hands shaking from the adrenaline dump. The door opened, and Marlena rushed in, abandoning all pretense of royal distance. She had a medical kit in her hands, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She knelt before him between his legs and began to apply a cooling gel to the bruises blooming on his ribs. Her touch was frantic at first, checking for broken bones, but it slowed as she realized he was whole. "You idiot," she hissed softly, her ears flattened against her skull. "You could have been killed. You should have stayed down. You should have run." "If I ran," Jard gasped, wincing as the gel stung his skin, "I wouldn't be much of a champion, would I? And besides, he telegraphs his left hook. You should tell him that." Marlena let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob. She rested her forehead against his knee, and for a long time they just stayed like that in the quiet of the room. The dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Before, she had been the protector and he the protected, but now she saw that he was willing to bleed for her. He was willing to stand in front of a train to prove he belonged by her side. She looked up at him, and the blue glow of her eyes seemed to soften into a deep ocean. "They will not stop," she whispered. "My father will not stop. Today was a game. Next time it will be a trial. They will try to take you from me using the law since they failed with force." Jard reached out and tucked a loose strand of silver hair behind her ear. "Then we will beat them at the law too. I've been reading the archives. Your kingdom runs on old statutes and forgotten rules. If they want a war of words, I have a lot more ammunition than they think." Marlena leaned into his hand, closing her eyes. The romantic tension in the room was no longer about curiosity or political rebellion. It was forged in the fire of shared danger. She realized she didn't just want him to survive for her sake, she wanted him to survive because the thought of a world without his stubborn, quiet courage was suddenly unbearable. She stood up, pulling him gently to his feet, and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his neck. The smell of her was overwhelming, wild and regal, but Jard held her tight, feeling the raw power in her frame, and knowing that for tonight at least they were safe. But safety on Lunaris is an illusion. Even as they held each other in the moonlight deep in the bowels of the castle, a conspiracy was being hatched. The king had realized that physical threats would not work because the human was too slippery, and the princess too invested. He needed a weapon that would destroy Jard's character and strip him of the one thing that protected him, his honor. Down in the archives, a corrupt scribe was altering a record, and in the treasury, a guard was planting a necklace of moonstones in a humble leather satchel. The physical war was over, but the political assassination was just beginning, and Jard would need more than leverage and luck to survive the morning. The dawn on Lunaris does not break gently like it does on Earth with a slow bleed of color across the horizon, but rather it arrives with a sudden and harsh clarity as the great ringed gas giant in the sky reflects the sun's light down onto the citadel in blinding white sheets. Jard awoke not to the warmth of the sun, but to the sound of his door being kicked off its hinges. The wood splintered with a violence that sent shards flying across the room, and before he could even swing his legs out of the bed, the room was filled with the armored bulk of the royal guard. This was not the casual intimidation of Captain Thorne in the training ring. This was an official state action conducted with the cold, mechanical precision of a military raid. They did not speak to him or acknowledge his questions as they tore the room apart, stripping the sheets from the bed and overturning the heavy wooden furniture with crashes that echoed down the stone corridor. Jard stood in his sleeping tunic barefoot on the cold stone and watched with a sinking feeling of inevitability as a guard knelt by his travel bag, the humble leather satchel that contained the only possessions he had brought from the stables. The guard, a young wolf with nervous eyes and gray fur, reached into the lining of the bag and pulled out a heavy silver chain from which hung a pulsating blue stone the size of a fist. The room went dead silent. It was the Moonstone Amulet, the sacred artifact worn by the first queen of Lunaris during the Unification Wars, and a religious icon that was supposedly locked in the deepest vault of the treasury. The guard held it up by the chain, and the blue light of the stone cast long dancing shadows against the walls, accusing Jard with its very presence. The captain of the squad turned to Jard with a look of genuine disgust and informed him that the penalty for touching the sacred regalia with human hands was death, but the penalty for stealing it was something far worse. They did not drag him this time. They marched him at spear point through the main halls, where the court had conveniently gathered early to witness the spectacle of the human's disgrace. The walk to the dungeon was a gauntlet of shame designed to strip away whatever dignity he had earned in the arena. Nobles who had looked at him with grudging respect only yesterday now spat at his feet and murmured insults about the treacherous nature of his species. They called him a thief and a rat and a scavenger who had bitten the hand that fed him. Jard kept his head up and his eyes forward, refusing to engage with the jeers, because he knew that any sign of anger or fear would only validate their prejudice. He saw the logic of the king's trap now, and he had to admire its cruelty, because it did not just target his life, it targeted his character. If they killed him in a duel, he would die a martyr, but if they executed him as a thief, he would die a disgrace, and Marlena would be shamed for having chosen him. It was a political assassination, performed with a stolen necklace. The dungeon of the Citadel of Moons was carved directly into the bedrock of the mountain, a damp and sunless place that smelled of ancient rot and the metallic tang of dried blood. They threw him into a cell that was little more than a pit in the stone, sealed by a laser grid that sizzled with lethal energy. The darkness was absolute save for the red glow of the barrier, and the temperature dropped until Jard could see his own breath misting in the air. He sat on the rough stone floor and pulled his knees to his chest, trying to conserve warmth and wondering if this was how it ended. He was a stable boy who had touched the stars, and now the stars were crushing him. Time lost its meaning in the dark, measured only by the dripping of water from the ceiling and the rhythmic patrol of the guards. He replayed the events of the morning in his mind, looking for a flaw in the frame-up, but the king had been thorough. The evidence was in his bag, and the testimony of the guards would be unanimous. Hours later, or perhaps days later, the sound of the outer door opening broke the silence. The footsteps that approached were not the heavy clanking tread of the guards, but the soft, frantic click of claws on stone. The laser grid deactivated with a dying whine, and a figure slipped into the cell wrapped in a heavy hooded cloak. It was Marlena. She threw back the hood, revealing a face that was haggard with stress, her ears flattened and her eyes wide with fear. She carried a bundle of supplies and a small datapad that glowed with map coordinates. She did not waste time with greetings, but immediately knelt beside him, grabbing his shoulders with a grip that was desperate and fierce. She told him in a hurried whisper that she had arranged a transport ship at the southern docking by a smuggler vessel that owed her a favor. She had bribed the guards on this level and disabled the perimeter sensors for a 3-minute window. She shoved the bundle into his hands, explaining that it contained credits and false identification documents that would get him to the neutral systems where her father's reach could not find him. She was shaking not from cold but from terror, and she pleaded with him to go now before the shift changed. She was offering him his life on a silver platter, a chance to run away from the nightmare and disappear into the anonymity of the galaxy. Jard looked at the bundle in his hands, and then he looked at the woman he loved. He saw the pain in her eyes, the belief that she had failed him by bringing him into this world. He slowly placed the bundle on the floor and took her hands in his. They were cold and trembling. He asked her quietly what would happen to her if he ran. She tried to look away, but he held her gaze. She admitted that the court would view his flight as an admission of guilt. They would say the human stole the heart of the princess and the treasure of the king, and ran away like a coward. Her standing would be destroyed, and her father would force her to marry Lord Kale to restore the honor of the royal house. She was willing to sacrifice her own future to save his life. That was the moment Jard made his choice. He stood up, pulling her up with him, and he spoke with a voice that was calm and absolute. He told her that he was not a pet to be let out the back door when things got difficult. He explained that if he ran away, he would be proving every hateful thing her father had ever said about humanity. He would be the thief and the coward they expected him to be. He told her that he did not come this far to leave her to the wolves, and that his honor was the only thing he actually owned in this universe. He would not trade it for a safe passage. He handed the bundle back to her and told her to cancel the ship. He was going to stand trial. Marlena stared at him as if he were insane. She argued that there was no justice in her father's court, that the trial was a sham, and the verdict was already written. She told him he would die. Jard smiled a sad, small smile and told her that he might die, but he would not run. He asked her to trust him one more time, not with her heart, but with her head. He needed her to do something for him, something specific involving the guard who found the amulet. He whispered the instructions to her, and she listened, her expression shifting from despair to confusion, and finally to a flickering spark of hope. She kissed him, then a desperate pressing of lips that tasted of salt and fear, and then she was gone, slipping back into the shadows, leaving him alone in the dark to wait for his judgment. The High Hall of Judgment was a cavernous chamber dominated by a circular podium, where the accused stood surrounded by tiers of stone benches filled with the nobility. The king sat at the highest level, flanked by the High Justiciar and the clan elders. Jard was brought in chains and placed in the center of the circle, the spotlight blinding him, while the rest of the room remained in shadow. The atmosphere was not one of a legal proceeding, but of a public execution. The High Justiciar, a wizened wolf with clouded eyes, read the charges in a droning voice that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Treason, grand larceny, desecration of a holy artifact. The punishment for any one of these was death. The evidence was presented with theatrical flair. The satchel was brought out. The amulet was displayed. The guard who found it, a nervous soldier named Vargas, stepped forward to testify. He recited his lines perfectly, stating that he had received an anonymous tip and had searched the guest quarters, finding the item hidden in the lining of the human's bag. The court murmured in performative outrage. The king watched with a smug satisfaction, believing the trap had snapped shut. When the prosecution rested, the High Justiciar looked down at Jard and asked if the accused had anything to say before sentencing. It was a rhetorical question. They expected him to beg. Jard stepped forward into the light. The chains rattled around his wrists. He did not address the king, but turned to face the guard Vargas. He asked the High Justiciar for permission to ask the witness a question regarding the timeline of the search. The king waved his hand dismissively, allowing it as a final amusement for the court. Jard looked at Vargas and asked him simply where he had been stationed prior to the search of the guest wing. Vargas hesitated, glancing at the king, before answering that he had been on patrol in the barracks, which were located on the eastern side of the citadel. Jard nodded slowly as if this confirmed something. He then turned to the court and pointed to the floor. He asked the nobles to look at the boots of the witness. Vargas was wearing the standard issue greaves of the guard, but clinging to the soles, and the edges of the metal was a distinct reddish clay that was drying and cracking under the heat of the lights. Jard raised his voice so it carried to the back of the hall. He explained that the Citadel of Moons is built on gray granite, and the barracks are paved with black slate. The guest wing has floors of polished marble. There is only one place within the Citadel walls that contains red clay, and that is the Royal Botanical Gardens, specifically the section where the night-blooming lilies are grown. The silence that fell over the hall was heavy and sudden. Jard continued his dissection of the lie with surgical precision. He explained that the night-blooming lilies are poisonous and require a specific mixture of iron-rich red clay to survive. He pointed out that the Royal Botanical Gardens are accessible only via the king's private elevator or the secure maintenance tunnels that lead directly to the royal vault. He asked the court why a guard who claimed to be in the barracks would have the soil of the king's private garden on his boots, unless he had been somewhere he wasn't supposed to be immediately before planting the evidence. Vargas began to stammer, looking wildly at his captain. The king's smug expression vanished, replaced by a scowl of thunderous fury. The clan elders, who were rigid traditionalists, began to lean forward, muttering among themselves. They did not like humans, but they liked dishonor even less. Jard drove the final nail in the coffin. He stated that if the court examined the security logs for the garden tunnels, they would likely find Vargas's biosignature there less than an hour before the arrest. He looked at the king then and said clearly that he did not steal the amulet, but rather it was carried to his room by a messenger who forgot to wipe his feet. The murmurs in the court turned into a roar of debate. The frame-up was unraveling in real time, not because Jard was stronger, but because he was observant. He had used the very environment of their world against them. Marlena stood up from her seat in the royal box, her eyes burning with triumph, and demanded that the logs be checked. The High Justiciar looked to the king for guidance, his gavel hovering uncertainly. The king knew he had lost the legal battle. The evidence was tainted, and the conspiracy was exposed. If he allowed the logs to be checked, his own complicity would be revealed. Vulcan stood up, and his chair scraped loudly against the stone floor, silencing the room instantly. He did not address the evidence or the clay or the logs. He looked down at Jard with a hatred that was pure and unadulterated. He declared that enough time had been wasted on the deceitful words of a species known for lying. He stated that the law of Lunaris was not written in ink, but in blood. He shouted that when the truth is obscured by tongues, it must be revealed by the blade. The king invoked the right of blood. He declared that since the honor of the royal house was in question, and the testimony was disputed, the matter would be settled by trial by combat. There would be no more lawyers and no more logic. Jard would face the accuser's champion in the arena at sunset, and the winner would be deemed innocent in the eyes of the gods. The crowd erupted in a frenzy of bloodlust, the earlier confusion forgotten in the anticipation of violence. Jard stood still in the center of the chaos. He had won the argument but lost the war for peace. He looked up at Marlena and saw the color drain from her face. She knew what this meant. The king would not send Vargas to fight. He would send his best. He would send a monster designed to kill. Jard felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach, but he did not regret his choice. He had exposed the king's dishonor, and now he would have to pay for it with his flesh. The guards moved in to drag him back to the holding cells, not to the dungeon this time, but to the preparation rooms of the arena. The intellectual game was over. The physical slaughter was about to begin. The waiting room beneath the grand arena was not designed for comfort or for reflection, but rather it was built to amplify the terror of those about to die. The walls were made of raw, unpolished black basalt that seemed to absorb the light from the single flickering glow rod on the ceiling, and the air was heavy with the smell of old copper and the sweat of 1,000 previous fighters who had spent their final moments packing this same cold floor. Jard sat on a stone bench that was too high for his legs, letting his feet dangle in a way that made him feel absurdly small and childlike. He was not packing, and he was not hyperventilating, because he had long ago learned that panic burns energy, and he would need every ounce of glucose in his blood for what was coming. He was holding a small stylus and a scrap of parchment he had begged from a guard, writing a letter that he knew would likely never be delivered. It was addressed to his mother back on Earth, a woman who thought he was working a safe administrative job in the core systems. He did not write about the king or the werewolves or the impending violence, but instead he wrote about the beauty of the double rings of Lunaris and the way the light hit the fungal forests at dawn. He wanted his last words to be about beauty, not about fear, because he refused to let Vulcan take the wonder of the universe away from him. The heavy iron door groaned open, and the noise echoed like a gunshot in the small space. Jard looked up expecting the executioner or the guards coming to drag him to the sand, but instead it was Marlena. She slipped inside and leaned her back against the door, closing it with a definitive thud as if she could shut out the rest of the world. She was carrying a bundle of equipment, but her hands were shaking so badly that the buckles clattered together like chattering teeth. She looked at him, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked small. The regal princess who commanded rooms and stared down generals was gone, replaced by a terrified woman who was watching the person she loved prepare for a slaughter. She dropped the gear on the bench and fell to her knees in front of him, clutching his hands, as if she were trying to physically anchor him to the mortal coil. Jard put the stylus down and looked at the armor she had brought. It was a masterpiece of dwarven engineering, a chest plate of articulated ceramite scales that could stop a laser blast and greaves that would protect his legs from crushing bites. It was also heavy. He ran his hand over the cool, smooth surface of the breastplate and then looked back at Marlena, shaking his head slowly. He explained to her in a voice that was calm and steady that he could not wear it. If he put on that armor, he would be trying to play their game by their rules. He would be a slow, clumsy turtle trying to fight a tiger, and Thorn would simply batter him until the metal crumpled inward and crushed his ribs. He needed to be fast. He needed to be light. He needed to be human. Marlena argued with him, her voice rising in panic as she told him that Thorn was a butcher who would not hesitate to tear him apart. She explained that Thorn had been given battle prayers by the priests, which was a polite way of saying he had been injected with combat stimulants that would numb his pain receptors and increase his aggression. She pleaded with him to take the protection to give himself a chance to survive the first hit. Jard listened to her, and he felt his heart breaking for her pain, but he knew he was right. He took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him to see the resolve in his eyes. He told her that he wasn't going into that arena to trade blows with a monster. He was going in there to solve a problem. And you don't solve a problem by hiding in a shell, you solve it by moving faster than the problem can think. He stood up and stripped off the ceremonial tunic he had been arrested in, leaving himself in his undershirt and trousers. He selected a simple leather vest from the pile she had brought, one that offered minimal protection but maximum range of motion. He strapped on a pair of lightweight boots, testing the grip on the stone floor. Then he looked at the weapons. There were heavy broadswords and massive axes, weapons designed for the supernatural strength of a werewolf. Jard pushed them aside and found what he was looking for at the bottom of the pile. It was a duelist's blade, a short sword with a monofilament edge and a weighted pommel. It was considered a toy by the nobility, a weapon for training children, but in human hands it was a scalpel. He weighed it in his hand, feeling the balance, and nodded. The sound of trumpets blasted from above, vibrating through the ceiling and shaking dust from the stones. The crowd was ready. The king was ready. Jard turned to Marlena and saw the tears tracking through the silver fur on her cheeks. This was the emotional crucible of their journey, the moment where the abstract concept of death became a physical reality standing in the room with them. Jard pulled her into a hug, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of rain and forest one last time. He told her that whatever happened out there, she had to promise him one thing. She had to promise that she would not let his death turn her into the monster her father wanted her to be. She had to rule with the heart he had seen in the quiet moments on the balcony. She sobbed against his chest, gripping him so tight he thought his ribs might crack before the fight even started, but she nodded against his shoulder. The guards banged on the door. It was time. Jard pulled away and wiped the tears from her face with his thumb. He gave her a wink, a small human gesture of bravado that seemed ridiculously out of place in an alien dungeon, and then he turned and walked out the door. He did not look back because he knew if he did he might lose the courage to take the next step. The walk up the tunnel to the arena floor was a journey from darkness into blinding light. The roar of the crowd grew louder with every step, a chaotic wall of noise that sounded like a physical force. Jard emerged onto the sand, and the heat hit him first, a dry, dusty heat that smelled of blood and roasted meat. The grand arena was a colossal bowl of white stone packed with 50,000 spectators. The banners of the 12 clans snapped in the wind, and the air was thick with the tension of bloodlust. In the center of the arena stood Captain Thorn. He had stripped off his armor and wore only a loincloth, his black fur glistening with oil. His eyes were fully dilated black pools of madness and foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. The stimulants were working. He looked less like a sentinel and more like a rabid beast. High above in the royal box, King Vulcan sat on his throne, looking down with the impassive gaze of a god who has already decided the fate of a mortal. Marlena stood beside him, rigid as a statue, her hands gripping the stone railing so hard the rock was pulverizing under her fingers. The king raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent, a hush that was more terrifying than the noise. He spoke no words of ceremony. He simply dropped a red handkerchief over the edge of the balcony. The fabric fluttered down, drifting lazily on the wind, a soft signal for a brutal end. As soon as the cloth touched the sand, Thorn moved. He did not strategize or circle, he simply exploded forward, kicking up a spray of sand behind him. He covered the distance between them in 3 massive bounds, his claws extended like scythes. Jard did not freeze. He had visualized this moment 1,000 times in the last hour. He waited until the last possible fraction of a second, until he could smell the chemical reek of the stimulants on Thorn's breath, and then he threw himself to the left. He didn't just dodge, he dove, rolling across the sand. Thorn's claws swiped through the air where Jard's chest had been with a sound like tearing canvas. The wind of the blow buffeted Jard, but he was already back on his feet, spinning to face his opponent. The crowd booed. They wanted a collision, not a dance. Thorn roared a sound of pure frustration and turned, charging again. This time he swept his arm in a wide arc trying to catch the slippery human in a net of pain. Jard ducked under the swing, but he wasn't fast enough to avoid the backswing. Thorn's forearm slammed into Jard's shoulder, and the impact sent him flying across the arena. Jard hit the ground hard, rolling to dissipate the force, but he felt something pop in his left shoulder, and a wave of nausea washed over him. He scrambled up, coughing dust, his left arm hanging uselessly by his side. The strength difference was even worse than he had calculated. One glancing blow had nearly incapacitated him. Thorn saw the injury and grinned, a horrific expression of blood-soaked triumph. He stalked forward, now taking his time, savoring the kill. He cornered Jard against the high stone wall of the arena, where there was no room to roll and no room to run. The crowd began to chant a rhythmic stomping beat that shook the ground. Jard pressed his back against the cool stone and gripped his short sword with his good right hand. He looked at Thorn, and he looked at the wall, and his mind raced. He remembered the stable duties, the way he used leverage to move bales of hay that were 10 times his weight. He looked at the heavy iron ring bolt set into the wall above his head, used for chaining up the great beasts during festivals. Thorn lunged for the throat, a killing strike meant to end the spectacle. Jard dropped his sword. It fell to the sand with a metallic clatter, and Thorn's eyes tracked it for a microsecond, distracted by the surrender. In that microsecond, Jard jumped not away from the beast but straight up. He kicked off the wall, grabbing the iron ring bolt with his good hand and swinging his legs up. Thorn's claws smashed into the stone where Jard's torso had been, showering the area with sparks and rock shards. Jard used the momentum of his swing to drive both of his boots into the side of Thorn's neck, right behind the ear, where the equilibrium cluster is located on a werewolf. It wasn't a strike of power, it was a strike of placement. The impact disrupted the fluid in Thorn's inner ear, and the massive wolf stumbled sideways, his balance shattered. He flailed, trying to find the horizon that was spinning wildly in his vision. Jard dropped from the ring, landing in the sand, and scooped up his sword. Thorn was on his knees, shaking his head, trying to clear the dizziness, his massive chest heaving. Jard stepped in behind him and kicked the back of Thorn's knee, collapsing the leg and forcing the captain face down into the dirt. In a heartbeat, Jard was on top of him. He wrapped his legs around Thorn's waist in a grapple and pressed the monofilament edge of his blade against the soft fur of Thorn's throat. He pulled back just enough to draw a thin line of red blood, but not enough to sever the artery. The entire arena went dead silent. 50,000 people stared in disbelief. The human was not dead. The human was riding the captain of the guard like a broken horse, and he had the power of life and death in his hand. Thorn froze. Even through the haze of the stimulants, the sensation of cold steel against his jugular cut through the madness. He knew he was beaten. He stopped struggling and let out a huff of defeated breath. Jard leaned close to his ear and whispered so only the wolf could hear. He told him that he was not a killer. He told him that this was what mercy looked like and that he should remember it. Jard pulled the blade away and rolled off, standing up on shaky legs. He backed away, holding his sword up in a salute to the king, signaling that the combat was over. He had won. He had proven his innocence by the right of blood. But King Vulcan did not stand up to applaud. He sat on his throne, his face twisting into a mask of purple rage. He had not expected the human to win, and he certainly had not expected him to show mercy, which in the king's twisted worldview was a sign of ultimate weakness. The king stood up and screamed down at the arena, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the bowl. He shouted that the fight was to the death. He declared that there is no victory without a kill. He pointed a trembling finger at Jard and ordered the perimeter guards to open fire. "Kill him," the king screamed. "Kill them both if you have to. Wipe this stain from my floor." The perimeter guards raised their energy lances, hesitant but trained to obey. The red targeting lasers painted Jard's chest, a dozen dots of light dancing over his heart. Jard stood tall. He did not cower. He looked up at the king and accepted that this was the end. He had played the game perfectly. He had won the moral victory, and now he would die for it. He closed his eyes and thought of the letter in his pocket. And then the sky fell. From the royal box, a shape launched itself over the railing. It was not the falling flutter of a handkerchief this time, but the plummeting dive of a predator. Marlena fell 50 feet, hitting the sand with an impact that shook the ground like a meteor strike. She landed on all fours in a crouch between Jard and the guards, and then she began to chain. Jard had seen her partial transformations before, the sharpening of claws, the glowing of eyes. But this was different. This was the royal avatar form, a biological capability reserved only for the direct bloodline of the throne, and usually only triggered by immense trauma or rage. Her body expanded, her bones cracking and reforming with wet, sickening pops that were audible across the silent arena. Her silver fur grew thick and lustrous, shielding her like armor. She grew to twice the size of a normal werewolf, standing nearly 9 feet tall at the shoulder. Her tail lashed the air like a whip, and a mane of pure white energy crackled around her neck. She threw her head back and let out a roar that was not a sound but a physical weapon. It shattered the glass in the viewing boxes. It forced the guards to drop their weapons and cover their ears. It was the sound of a planet screaming. She stood over Jard, shielding his broken body with her own massive form. She looked up at her father on the balcony and bared teeth that were the size of daggers. Her eyes were no longer blue, they were white hot stars of pure fury. The guards lowered their lances, not out of disobedience but out of instinctual terror. You do not shoot a goddess. You do not attack the avatar of the moon. Marlena turned her head slightly to look at Jard, who was staring up at her in awe. She did not speak because she no longer had a throat capable of human speech, but the rumble in her chest vibrated through the ground and into his bones. It was a sound of absolute protection. She was telling him that the time for politics was over. The time for law was over. The king wanted a monster, he had finally created one. Thorn, who was still kneeling in the sand, looked up at the massive silver beast standing over the human who had spared his life. He looked at the king, who was screaming impotently from the balcony. Slowly, painfully, Thorn stood up. He picked up his discarded sword. He did not move to attack Jard. He turned his back on the human and the princess and faced the king's guards. He banged his sword against his chest plate once, twice, 3 times. A salute. He was joining the rebellion. The arena held its breath. The king looked down at the daughter he had tried to break and realized with a dawn of horror that he had not just lost a champion, he had lost his kingdom. The silence stretched thin and brittle, ready to shatter into civil war. Jard reached out and rested his hand on Marlena's massive flank, feeling the heat of her rage, and he knew that the next few minutes would decide the fate of the entire world. The silence that hangs over the grand arena is heavier than the stone blocks that form its walls, because it is the silence of a world holding its breath while history decides which way it is going to fall. We are standing in the eye of a hurricane where the only movement is the twitching of Captain Thorn's ears as he stares down the barrel of his own soldiers, rifles, and dares them to fire upon the avatar of their goddess. The energy lances of the perimeter guard are humming with a lethal potential, but the hands holding them are shaking because every werewolf in that stadium knows that to fire on the royal avatar is not just treason, but heresy of the highest order. Marlena stands like a silver mountain of fur and divine wrath shielding Jard's broken body, and the low rumble radiating from her chest is vibrating through the soles of our boots and rattling the teeth of the nobility in the high stands. This is the moment where the chain of command shatters against the hard rock of faith and biology. King Vulcan screams from the balcony, and his voice cracks with the desperation of a man who realizes his absolute power has just evaporated like mist under a noon sun. He orders the execution of the traitor Thorn and the abomination Jard, but his words drift down into the arena and die there unheeded. The lieutenant of the perimeter guard looks at the king, and then looks at the massive silver wolf who is baring teeth the size of daggers, and he makes a choice that saves his soul but ends his career. He deactivates his lance and lowers the muzzle to the ground, and that simple mechanical click is the loudest sound in the universe. It triggers a cascade effect, as one by one the 100 guards ringing the sand lower their weapons and take a step back, signaling their refusal to participate in this sacrilege. The crowd sees this shifting of loyalty, and a murmur starts to build that sounds like the approach of a tidal wave, as 50,000 citizens realize that the king has lost the mandate of heaven. Vulcan watches this betrayal, and his face twists into a mask of pure, unadulterated madness, because a tyrant can survive hatred, but he cannot survive irrelevance. He turns from the railing and rips the ceremonial cloak from his shoulders, revealing the combat armor he wears beneath his robes, which is a suit of black biomechanical plate that pulses with a sickly green internal light. He does not flee, and he does not negotiate, because he is a creature of blood and dominance who believes that if he can kill the symbol of the rebellion itself will die. He draws his own weapon, which is a massive double-bladed war glaive that hums with a disrupting energy field, and he leaps from the royal box. He does not land with the grace of his daughter, but crashes into the sand with the force of a falling anvil, sending a shockwave of dust rolling across the arena floor. The king stands up and ignites the glaive, and the sound is a screeching wail that hurts the ears. He charges directly at Marlena, and he is shouting a war cry that is not a word, but a raw projection of his intent to commit filicide. Marlena roars in response and meets his charge head-on, and the collision between the two massive predators creates a thunderclap that blows the hats off the nobles in the front row. It is a clash of titans that defies description, as silver fur meets black armor and claws meet energized steel. They tear at each other with a ferocity that turns the arena into a blur of motion and violence, while Jard drags himself painfully toward the arena wall, trying to get his injured leg out of the crush zone. The fight is not going well for Marlena, because while she has the raw power of the Avatar, she lacks the centuries of combat experience that her father possesses. Vulcan fights dirty, using the reach of his glaive to keep her claws at bay and striking at her joints with surgical precision. He sweeps the blade low and cuts a deep gash into her flank, causing her to stumble and howl in pain. The crowd screams in horror as the king presses his advantage, driving his shoulder into her chest and knocking her onto her back in the sand. He stands over her, raising the glaive for a killing thrust that will pierce her heart and end the line of succession in a single stroke. He is blinded by his bloodlust and focused entirely on the daughter he considers a failure, and he has forgotten the one variable in the arena that he has consistently underestimated. Jard is leaning against the wall, clutching his side where his ribs are surely broken, and his vision is swimming with gray spots of shock, but his mind is as sharp as the razor edge of his sword. He sees the king raise the weapon, and he sees the exposed joint in the back of Vulcan's armor, where the neck plating meets the torso assembly. It is a target no bigger than a coin, but it is the only vulnerability in the king's defense. Jard looks around for a weapon, but his sword is too far away in the sand. His eyes land on the discarded energy lance that Captain Thorn had dropped when he switched sides. It is heavy and designed for a werewolf's grip, but Jard grabs it with both hands and grits his teeth against the agony in his shoulder. He does not try to shoot it because he doesn't know the codes, but he knows it is a long metal rod with a heavy power cell at the end. He screams to draw the king's attention, and Vulcan pauses for a microsecond, his head turning slightly to acknowledge the insect he thought was crushed. In that split second, Jard throws the lance not as a projectile to pierce, but as a javelin to jam. The weapon sails through the air in a desperate, clumsy arc that wobbles in flight, but Jard's aim from years of tossing hay bales and guiding herds is true. The heavy butt of the rifle slams into the back of the king's knee, right into the actuator of the power armor. The joint sparks and seizes, and the king's leg buckles under the sudden loss of support. The killing blow goes wide, slamming into the sand inches from Marlena's throat. The distraction is all Marlena needs. She twists her massive body with a fluidity that seems impossible for her size, and snaps her jaws around the haft of the king's glaive, shattering the weapon with a crunch of metal and glass. She lunges upward and pins her father to the ground, her immense weight pressing him into the dirt, until the armor groans and sparks. She places one massive paw on his chest and brings her face down to his so that her fangs are hovering millimeters from his exposed throat. The king struggles and thrashes, spitting curses and trying to claw at her eyes, but she lets out a growl so deep and so resonant that it vibrates the fluid in his inner ear and paralyzes him with the primal dominance of a true alpha. The entire stadium freezes as they wait for the kill, because in the history of Lunaris, a challenged king is always killed by the challenger. Vulcan stares up at the death hovering above him and waits for the dark, expecting the bite that will end his life. But the bite does not come. Marlena holds him there pinned and helpless and stares into his eyes with a gaze that is not filled with hate, but with a profound and terrible pity. She denies him the martyrdom he seeks. She slowly lifts her head and looks up at the crowd, and then at the nobles, and finally at the guards. She lets out a sharp barking command that does not need translation. She is claiming the victory, but she is refusing the slaughter. Captain Thorn understands immediately. He rushes forward with 2 other guards who have defected, and they strip the broken armor from the king. Vulcan is dragged to his feet, stripped of his weapon and his protection and his dignity. He stands there shivering, not from cold, but from the shock of being spared by someone he considered weak. Thorn looks at the king and speaks loudly enough for the court to hear, stating that a king who tries to murder his own blood to keep a crown is fit neither to rule nor to live among the clans. He places the king under arrest for treason against the sacred laws of the duel, and the guards who 5 minutes ago were ready to kill for Vulcan now surround him and march him out of the arena. Marlena watches him go, and then her strength fails her. The avatar form is a massive drain on biological resources, and as the adrenaline fades, her body begins to shrink and crack as it reforms into her humanoid state. She collapses onto the sand, a shivering heap of silver fur and exhaustion. Jard ignores the pain in his own body and limps toward her, falling to his knees in the dirt beside her. He pulls her head into his lap, stroking the matted fur and whispering reassurances that it is over and that she is safe. She opens her eyes, which have returned to their natural blue, and looks up at him with a mixture of relief and adoration. The medic teams finally rush the field, swarming over them with stretchers and stabilization fields, but Jard refuses to let go of her hand even as they load him onto the grav sled. The weeks that follow are a blur of healing tanks and political restructuring, as the kingdom of Lunaris tries to understand what just happened to it. The trial of Vulcan is short and private, resulting in his exile to a monastery on the dark side of the moon, where he can meditate on his failures without endangering the realm. The coronation of Marlena is scheduled for the first night of the full moon, and the anticipation in the capital is electric, because it is not just a coronation but a celebration of a new era. The xenophobia that defined her father's reign has been shattered by the image of a human standing back-to-back with the Avatar, and the city is filled with off-worlders who have come to witness the ascension of the Wolf Queen. The Great Hall of the Citadel is transformed for the ceremony. The dark banners of war are replaced with tapestries of silver and blue depicting the harmony of the spheres. The nobility is gathered in their finest armor and silks, but there is a new humility in their posture as they wait for their monarch. The heavy doors swing open and Marlena enters. She is breathtaking, wearing a gown of woven moonlight that shimmers with every step, and a crown of simple platinum that sits on her brow with a natural weight. She walks with a regal grace that commands the room, but she stops halfway to the throne and turns back toward the doors, extending her hand. Jard steps out of the shadows. He is wearing the formal attire of a high lord, a tunic of deep midnight blue with silver embroidery, but he has refused the ceremonial sword, preferring to keep his hands empty and open. He walks with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the price he paid for this peace, but his head is high. He takes Marlena's hand, and a hush falls over the room as the Queen of Lunaris walks the rest of the path to the throne, hand in hand with a human former stable boy. When they reach the dais, there is a moment of confusion among the elders because Marlena does not sit on the massive obsidian throne of her ancestors. She gestures to the servants, who bring out a second chair identical in height and craft to her own and place it beside the throne. She turns to the court and speaks in a voice that is clear and strong. She declares that a ruler who sits alone sits in fear, and that she intends to rule with the wisdom of two worlds. She names Jard not as a consort or a pet, but as the prime protector of the realm and the shield of the queen. She places a silver circlet on his head herself, and the court erupts in a roar of approval that shakes the dust from the rafters. It is a sound of genuine joy because they have seen that strength comes in many forms, and the strongest form is partnership. We move forward in time now to the final image of our journey together. The celebrations have quieted down, and the guests have departed, leaving the castle in a peaceful slumber. We are back on the balcony, where the story truly began, overlooking the bioluminescent forests that glow with a soft, pulsating rhythm in the night. The air is cool and smells of pine and distant rain. Marlena is leaning against the stone railing, her royal finery discarded for a simple robe, and Jard is standing behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, and his chin resting on her shoulder. They are looking up at the sky, where the rings of the gas giant are catching the light of the suns. Marlena sighs a sound of deep contentment and leans back into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. She asks him quietly if he ever misses the simplicity of the stables or the quiet life he left behind on Earth. Jard laughs softly and tightens his arms around her. He tells her that he doesn't miss a thing because, for the first time in his life, he isn't just watching the stars, he is holding the brightest one in his arms. He tells her that the stables were just practice for the hardest job in the universe, which is keeping a wild wolf happy. Marlena turns in his arms and looks at him with eyes that hold the depth of the ocean. She tells him that he didn't tame the wolf, but rather he taught the wolf that it didn't have to be alone in the dark. She kisses him then, and it is a kiss that bridges the gap between species and planets, a promise of a future where love is the only law that matters. The camera pulls back, slowly leaving them there in the moonlight, two souls who defied an empire and won. The wind rustles the leaves of the silver trees below, whispering the legend of the human champion, and the Wolf Queen, a story that will be told to cubs on Lunaris for 1,000 generations. And as we fade from this world of silver fur and blue moonlight, remember that the greatest stories are not about the wars we win with weapons, but the battles we win with our hearts. This is the universe reminding you that no matter how small you feel or how big the monsters are, you have a strength inside you that can move mountains if you just have the courage to stand your ground. Until we meet again under another sun, keep your eyes on the stars and your heart open to the impossible.